let me just show you what the neuroscience is telling us about how the growth happens. There are, and again, there are all sorts of people studying different parts of the brain. I don't know how many of them talk to each other. I don't know how many of them are putting all this information together. When and if I ever have time in my retirement to do more study on this, maybe I will. I have just gathered bits and pieces of research that is around, some of which Dr. Neufeld has gathered together as well and has shared with me. And so I'm just going to touch on some of these findings that are there, but you'll start to see there's a picture that emerges. So we talked about the prefrontal cortex, basically, and it houses the executive functions. So what do we know about play? Sustained engagement in an activity demands the ability to stay selectively focused on the situation at present and to tune out distractions and hold the information in our head. So when children are playing and are engaged with something, any of you that have observed in the classrooms, you see that a child who is really engaged with, as I say, pouring sand from one container into another and watching how it pours and watching all the, whatever it is they're doing, it doesn't matter what they're doing. One thing that's happening there is that it's developing the capacity to focus. And again, they've looked at Montessori children. And what they found was, again, I'm not an expert in Montessori education, but there are many movements in education, and Montessori is one of them, where you don't interfere with the play activity of a child. You never make a comment on what it is that they're playing. You try not to interrupt them in their play, unless, of course, it's time for food or whatever. You let them play at the rate at which they do. And what they found was that children who had fewer interruptions during their learning activities, which is what they call them in Montessori, it is the child actually engaging in play, perform better at executive function tasks than the group that were not in a school that respected play in the same way. The prefrontal cortex as well. Jack Panksepp, who unfortunately has passed away, started in the latter years of his life as a scientific researcher to really focus on play, and he has a couple of books on it. So here are just a few quotes from him. One function of play is to take you to the edge of your emotional knowledge so that you can learn what you can and cannot do to others. Okay, so he's now talking about social play. We have some Canadian researchers called Pellis and Pellis, and you'll see some quotes from them in this slide and the next slide, where they studied rough and tumble play they were actually using rats. The irony of it is that for some reason, rats have some similar brain structures that we do as humans, and that's why they use rats. It is very hard to study the brain of children who are doing rough and tumble play, because first of all, we don't let children do rough and tumble play very much. And it's really hard to study it in as way as they can. But what they found was that rough and tumble play, which, by the way, all mammals engage in. All young mammals engage in rough and tumble play. Now, we would think that if a mammal was engaging in it, it isn't just something that's lovely that they do, which is kind of fun, but kind of by the by. There must be some reason. And they basically have found that when these animals are allowed to do rough and tumble play, they actually improve their capacity to develop social skills, the ability to get along with others. Again, I'm going to read what was said here because it's very interesting. Rough and tumble play, which can ride the edge of ambiguity. When does it turn from play into not play, into something more aggressive? It requires continual reassurances that generates the neural circuits that enable animals to accurately read ambiguous social signals, right? And it builds their social intelligence and their capacity for relationship. Now, I'm not going to get into a big talk today about whether or not we should be allowing rough and tumble play in our classrooms, but some of this kind of play fighting stuff that children do I think needs to be tolerated, at least a certain amount of it, because it seems to make those connections happen in that prefrontal cortex. What their conclusions are, and there's a number of different researchers, as you can see, it seems to shape the prefrontal cortex and have an impact on self-regulation and planning, which is, of course, what we want our preschool programs to do. So it seems to facilitate the maturation of the inhibitory skills, because one of the things the prefrontal cortex does as well is it brings two emotions in, one emotion which kind of counteracts or inhibits the other emotion, or a thought that can counteract an emotion. Like it's not even so much about what you do, it's about what you can stop doing, and that's a really hard thing for the brain to do. And so what they found was when rough and tumble play happened, you have to look, reflect, look, listen, feel. You've got this urge to do it, but you've got to modulate that urge as well. And Panksepp then says that this translates into an empathy, imagination, and creative play. Now, Stephen Porges, another very interesting person who has also a large theory called the polyvagal theory, is basically he looked at kind of what happens in the autonomic nervous system when this kind of play goes on. And he says that we have two states that we're in. One state is when we're worried about survival, and then there's a whole bunch of things that happen with that. But how do mammals or children know when they're actually playing and not going to be hurting each other? The question is, what keeps the play from turning violent? And Porges says that it relies on a sense of safety. And so when we're not afraid, so when our children are feeling safe, and again, remember that very often when play fighting turns to violence, one of those children is usually a child who has experienced trauma and a threat to their survival. So maybe they aren't reading these things well, but well-functioning children have this ability to downregulate these defensive reactions. He calls it the vagal brake, right? Which basically means that even though you look like you are upset with each other, you know that it is in fun. And how do you know that it's in fun? Well, it's in fun because actually there are facial cues, the play face, and we all have that. Perhaps you've seen somebody who loves playing kind of slightly roughly with children, and they'll kind of do this look, and they'll go and they'll run and they'll chase and they'll maybe tickle, or they'll sometimes throw a child up, but it's all in the face that says, I'm not going to hurt you. This is going to be fun. And that actually affects the brain. And so we become sensitive to those things. And when they've done videos of animals that have played together, they see the play face. They continually reassure each other that they are still playing. And actually, very rarely do they hurt each other. They've actually even videotaped a wolf playing with a dog. As long as the two of them kind of match their play behaviors, they were actually able to play together without hurting each other. There's actually even signals that signal the end of play. One of our problems with some of our children that get into trouble is they do not read the signals very well. So when the other child is saying, I've had enough, they keep doing it. That's when the trouble happens. It's not the actual play fighting that is the problem. So we have this smiling face, we have laughter and vocalizations that let the other one know that we are still playing. And again, for most of you that have children at home, let's use your children at home as the example. You know when the two siblings, and it's often brothers, but it could be a brother and sister, are play fighting, and all of a sudden you hear a change in vocalizations. You don't even have to look over, and all of a sudden there's going to be trouble. And many of you walk right over and say, okay, I think we need to do something else right now, because you've already noticed the change, and it could go into something else. But the bottom line is, if we never let children go to some of those places, the brain isn't going to build as effectively as it should.